Susan Daly, welcome back to the podcast.
Steve Vargo, thanks for having me.
Last time we were live at the Connection,
Yes.
and I would encourage anyone to go back and listen to that episode. It was a very popular episode. It was called, you could scroll back a little bit. We did this live at the Connection back in February, I believe, and the episode was titled The Simple Optical Reducing Complexity to Increase Capture. And maybe to some degree, we'll be picking up a little bit on that today. But I was thinking about our conversation today, and I think what we're talking about is taking the guesswork out of one of the most fundamental aspects of owning a practice, and that would be frame purchasing. And that includes everything from setting up an optical to maintaining inventory to replenishing the frames. And something I've come to realize over the years, and I'm curious your take on this as well. Most practices don't have a frame problem, they have a decision-making problem. And when we look at that, what I mean is there's no system in place. There's no clear signal for when to hold a frame or let it go. And a lot of it is based on gut feel without an actual strategy. So,
Correct.
would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I think frame buying and kind of fashion buying in any sense is very much art and science. It's what they teach in what I studied, which is merchandising management. You develop a buy of any product, but you're developing that buy potentially 2 to 3 years in advance. So you will always be wrong. So you're looking at the numbers, you're going by the numbers, but at the end of the day, there's some nuance to it. And I think that's where people get tripped up. It's where they probably focus too much. And, kind of going back to our podcast we did earlier this year about complexity, we're just making it too difficult. And I think there's a very simple groundwork that can be laid for frame buying that you can then build on, but at least you have a foundation. And that's what we're going to talk about.
What does simple look like to you? And maybe this is sort of an all-encompassing. If I were being hired at your practice and I said, what does it look like? I was going to be trained as an optician. What does simple look like to you? And where do practices make things overly complex?
For your frame buying specifically, you should be able to fit a guideline on an index card. So you should be able to hand whoever's doing your frame buying an index card of a few simple rules that you've decided together. Some of that is cadence, some of that is numbers, and they should be able to use that for the majority of the year without asking any further questions, without getting any further approvals. And the practice should be in a good place from a cash flow perspective, from a cost of goods perspective, and from an assortment and inventory perspective. So that's what I mean by simple. I sat next to a doctor at one of our conferences, the Connection one year, and he was taking notes on one of those old school diner pads, the small green ones. And he's just taking notes. And I said, "Do you need paper?" And he said, "No, if it doesn't fit on here, I don't understand it." And that was years ago. And that just stuck with me. And it's true. If you can't narrow down your process to an index card, it's too complex. So that's what I mean by complexity and simplicity.
But I think we have to look at too is how does that transfer to the patient? Don't want to get too far off course here because I do want to focus on the frame buying and the frame sales, but it's really interesting on the complexity part. I was just listening to some things. I'm actually doing some research on different strategies for reducing the walkout rate. It's really interesting because, as you know, we do these events for IDOC, quarterly study dinners, and I've been collecting a lot of the feedback from these groups. And something I've been hearing pretty consistently is the number of practices that are taking a more proactive approach with reducing the walkouts instead of just saying patients only want what their insurance covers and then going onto social media groups and complaining about it. They're actually saying, let's go on offense here. And maybe stay tuned for an upcoming episode because I'm putting it together for that. But one of the things it was talking about was the objection over price. with the patient. And what the research is suggesting is it's not always just a price issue, but one of the issues that patients have is the complexity. When we walk into an optical, we look around at the frames and it can't be explained to us really quick. We're looking at the frame. Does that include the lenses? What are the lenses going to cost? How much does my insurance cover? And all the other things that factor into the price. We're sitting there when an optician types away at a calculator, developing anxiety over what is the final cost going to be. So the simpler we can make it for the patient, I think people really underestimate that as well.
I'm going to be bold and say that patients never walk out because of the price. Because every patient that comes into your practice likely has a car, at least 90% of them, lives somewhere, whether they're paying an exorbitant amount in rent or they own a house. They came in wearing a wardrobe that probably costs more than any frame you're going to sell them. So it's not the actual price, it's value for money. And part of how people feel value is time and attention. And if you think about every engagement with a patient as a date, if I'm on a date, the only thing that matters is the time you're giving me and the attention you're giving me. And the reason I mention that is because I think the opticians' minds are too clouded with complexity. So they're not really able to engage with a single person at a single time, look them in the eye, and give them that first date experience, that time and attention. And that can be sensed very easily by people, whether they're usually not aware of it, but that's what we do. And there's a clear example of this from our last Vision Forward event. I've never sat into the lectures that you've given and Nathan Hayes has given and Jeremy Bono has given in one day because we usually lecture on different days. I've been to all of your lectures, but I made the mistake, and I call it a mistake, of sitting in on every single one of the lectures and then trying to give my lecture. And my lecture was so clouded. My mind was so clouded with great ideas and concepts and everything that I could mention that would harken back to your lectures, and that I didn't feel that I did the best job that I could. And that's, as people, our teams and our staff are coming in with those clouded minds. And then we cloud their minds with all of the products that we offer. And then you layer on top of that insurance. So it is complexity at the end of the day. And what we do want to do is spend our time with those patients when they're there and when we can, and give them the time and attention. What we never want is any of that time and attention be given to a rep or a frame company when business is open and we should be spending that time with the patients. So that index card approach for frame buying will help walkouts just from the fact that we're not going to have reps coming constantly into the practice. That's part of it.
Yeah, it's something, and I appreciate the dating advice as well. Oh,
Always. I mean, last time we destroyed online dating, right? Which we can get into again.
it is a
Doesn't work.
theme.
Too many
Yeah,
options. Yeah.
yeah,
And now we're talking about I am married. So happily married. But the thing about dating is it's people, right? It's sales. When you sit down and you're meeting a friend or a prospective partner, it's just two people interacting. And at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's happening in the optical. It's just two people interacting. And the more time and attention you can give that person, the better off the interaction will be.
yeah. And I think we'll see that increasing as things become more technology driven, is people getting back to the relationships with the patient. And maybe I'm overly optimistic about that, but I still think that's something that patients want, that the doctors want as well. And yeah, again, we're getting off onto another topic, but as we start to see technology, AI start to take over more aspects of the practice, I think there's pros and cons to that. But one of the things I think it does, it allows us to get back to just that, giving more time and attention back to the patient and being able to have the conversations with them that maybe we're not having. And again, I know we're kind of being a little bit redundant with this, but getting back to the simplicity of how we explain things to patients. I can kind of nerd out on the research on this, but one of the reasons people walk out, it's not unique to healthcare consumers, but in any consumer scenario, when they just don't understand what's been explained to them, then
Mhm.
they're more likely to walk out. I made that mistake over and over when I first started practicing because I was young and I wanted to sound smart. So if you came in and you were diabetic, oh my gosh, I was going to confuse the heck out of you with, I was just going to go on and on because I was 27 and I wanted to sound like I wanted you to believe in what I had to say and I wanted to build confidence, but I think what I was doing was making the mistake of just building confusion.
Hmm.
And that was a mistake on my part from a communication standpoint. And I learned to recognize that if I want patients to not just hear me, but take action on something, then I've got to learn to simplify the messaging. And the same thing happens out there in the optical as well. Um, I want to get back to the topic that we're going to talk about because when I initially reached out to you, you said you're having a lot of conversations about the frame purchasing part. You said something early on this conversation that we're often going to get it wrong. So, can you elaborate on that a little bit? And how does someone feel confident in terms of um, when we look at the difference between a practice that's confident about what's on their board and one that's just hoping that it works out, right? What is the difference
Hmm.
between those two practices? And how does a practice become more confident when they walk into their optical that yes, I have the right mix here. I have the right styles for my market. And it's not an easy decision because regardless, there's going to be some guesswork and some predictions that go into that.
Yeah, I think there are three things to focus on. One is creating processes and procedures that you can follow for the majority of the time in terms of frame buying and how to set up the optical physically, and also how you interact with the patients. But we're not really going to talk about capture rate and sell through today. We're really talking about how to set up the optical. So creating that index card of what is the process, what are the procedures, what are we going to agree that we're going to do, and then don't second guess that. Just put that aside. That's our process. And then you want to stop guessing what your patients want in your optical and ask them. So whenever a patient leaves without buying anything, ask them, is there a style, color, or brand that we could have for you next time that you didn't see? And most people won't tell you, but some people will. And that will give you, as long as you ask every patient that leaves that same question, which again is a process that we're going to write down and agree to do, and not pick and choose the patients that we're going to ask, they'll tell you exactly what you should bring in. I would say what brand I'm looking for. I only wear X, or I'm really looking for this color. Or we're not going to ask about price, but we're going to ask what we could have for them from a style and desire perspective next time. And write those things down and take them at their value. Someone isn't going to tell you I'm looking for this brand when they're actually looking for another brand. So take it at face value, write down exactly what they said, and then do that. And the third thing is practice. We need to practice with our assortment. It's really difficult to bring in a brand and never have the staff try it on, never have the doctors try it on, not tell anyone the different styles that have come in, the price point, the materials, not have the rep do a training. And you say, well, I don't have time for these things. Well, we don't have time for these things because we're constantly changing our assortment. But if you only bring in one or two new brands a year and drop one or two low performing brands a year, you absolutely have time for those things. And so, anytime you introduce a new product in any business around the world, if you don't train the team on the new product and they're not aware of it, it's not top of mind, it's not going to be successful. So, practice with your team, understanding your assortment, where different frames are, what the best sellers are, which frames look good on everybody, and train them on the new products that come in. The entire team, from techs to doctors to the doctor's spouse, if they come in once a week to do paperwork, everybody needs to understand the products in the optical. So, processes and procedures, take the guesswork out of it and just ask, and then practice with your assortment.
You said something else early on about tracking data, which leads to my next question. What are some of the biggest frame buying decisions you've watched that somebody gets wrong? And what's driving that decision? And let me throw something out there. It's my guess. Is it related to a lack of data? There's the famous Peter Drucker quote, if you can't measure it, you can't improve it. And I think what happens a lot of times in the optical that decisions are driven by gut or maybe just Kim, the optician who's been there a long time, just really loves this certain line that doesn't necessarily sell. Not always the case, but do we have the data I would be looking at that's driving the decisions around purchasing. So my instinct goes to that. But would you agree with that, or is there something else you would point to and say this is the most common frame purchasing mistake that I see?
No, I think you're right. I think it is data, and it's interesting from a field that is very data driven, right? We talk about prescriptions and we talk about refractive errors and we talk about number of patients and how often they come back. We're a very data driven industry. But when it comes to frame buying, we tend to think it's all fashion and less data. And in reality, we want to start with the data and then tell a story. And the most critical way to analyze your frame sales is to rank your brands by revenue generation for the previous 12 months. So top to bottom, not by units sold, but once a year, look at your sales and say which brands generated the most revenue for me. And that is just a single data point, but it's a really critical one. And from there, we can talk about the stories that we tell and the decisions that we make. But without that information, you're flying mostly on instinct. And we often talk about not dropping a managed vision care plan because of the patients that we'll lose and the revenue that we'll lose. But we never talk about the fact that we just got a new rep in for this brand because our old rep left and now we hate that rep and we want to drop the brand. Well, where does that brand sit in terms of the revenue that it's generating for you? And if you hate the new rep and it's not generating any revenue, okay, you have two data points now where you can clearly make a decision. You can draw a line under that decision and say, that's why I made that decision. For example, if you hate the rep, but it's your number one revenue generating brand, call the company and say, I will drop your brand if you don't give me a different rep. So you can make different decisions based on art and science, but you need the science in order to create the story of the art of frame buying.
I know a lot of reps listen to this show. You've mentioned reps now several times. How should you engage a rep when they come to the practice? Because there's one thing, and I've heard practices say, I love our rep for this company, and I don't like the rep so much for that company. As someone with an optical background, optician, what should you be getting out of a rep? And maybe this is partly directed toward a rep, but also partly directed toward you, the owner, the optician. How can you help control that relationship? When somebody comes in, you're taking time away from patients, you're taking time out of your day to meet with the rep. How can you help control or navigate that relationship to get the most out of that? Because they are an incredibly helpful resource, maybe one of the most helpful resources to help drive the optical.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear that I don't blame reps and I don't blame opticians. It's a no fault relationship. It is one of the most dysfunctional relationships that I see in optometry because what I hear from reps is I hate it when I go into a practice and the optician just starts flipping frames in the tray based on what they like and is not taking my advice on the newest or the best of what I could put into the practice, or the fact that they need 40 pieces in order for the brand to be successful instead of the 12 that they're buying from me, right? And then I talk to opticians and they say, I hate when the reps show up unannounced and I have to quickly flip frames just so that I can fill my boards. And I have no information about how that brand is performing and I'm not prepared. And I wish they had come in a different time. And these things can very easily be fixed with good communication, but it is one of the most dysfunctional relationships through no fault of anyone's in the industry. And there are levels of opticians and levels of reps. There are levels of frame buyers who are not interested in data, and there are reps who are simply going in just to hit quotas. And so it exists on a range on both sides. But reps at their best extent are a partner to the practice. They understand their brand. They understand that the brand will do well in your area. They know what other people are selling it for at retail. They know what they're getting for it. They know where the online competition is. They understand the brand story and how to sell it through to patients. They very often come from an opticianry background and can even help with lens selection, can help with, these are the best frames for your progressive wearers. So there's a just amazing amount of information that a good rep can provide, and an amazing amount of merchandising support that they can give, actually making the brand look good on the board, advising how many pieces you should carry. And then the opticians have an amazing amount of information about their patients and their doctor and their practice and their goals and what they're trying to achieve. So I actually think it's better to see the reps less frequently, but have a more in-depth conversation. Spend an hour with one rep and have a conversation about their brand. Understand the 3 fast fun facts. That's not mine, that's Robin Brush's, so I'll give her credit on that one. Understand the brand story, how to sell it to patients. And then for the rep, they can then understand what are your goals for the practice. And then they become less of a salesperson and more of a partner. But that, in order to spend that amount of time, you have to have that plan on a page. You have to understand which reps we want to see in person, and those are going to be your top performing brands. And you can decide where to cut that off, whether it's top 3, top 5, top 10, depending on how much time your frame buyer has in general. And then how often we're going to see them. And I really only recommend maximum twice a year. We do a reassort on our top brands.
I completely agree. I think in an ideal scenario that the term partnership is the exact right word to use. I think anyone in private practice needs a network around them. It's very, for an OD, especially practice owner, you're very siloed. You don't have a lot of support within the practice typically. So whether it's consultants, reps, outside experts is getting as much help and support as you can get, I think will help you obviously operate a better practice. I developed a newfound respect for reps actually when I got in a year or two. I've shared this story before, but I got to travel around with the rep and I got to see the different reactions when you walked into different practices. Some
Yes.
practices you would walk in and they would embrace the rep with open arms. And the rep was great. I won't share the name here to embarrass her, but she had so much value to add. And the ones that actually took the time to meet with her, it was such a great interaction between the rep and the practice. Other practices I'd walk into, I found this really interesting. They would just scatter, like they wanted nothing to do. Oh no, not another
Yep.
rep.
I've seen that too. Yeah.
It's crazy. And I just thought if you saw what happened at the last practice, what I would say to any practice is be more intentional with it. Don't put yourself in that position where you're not ready for the rep they're coming in and you're just
Mhm.
sort of, okay, now I've got to give you 10, 15 minutes of my time to sit there and listen, but rather, what do you want to get? And maybe that's more of a practice decision than a one person decision, but really be more intentional with what you want to get out of that relationship. So when they walk in, here's the things we need. Do I need training? Do I need more support? Do I have questions? Whatever it is be more intentional. I actually think the reps will appreciate that too, because the last thing they want to feel like is an uninvited guest walking into your practice. But I saw it up front and it made me have a newfound respect for reps and also kind of be glad I wasn't one because
It's a
it
very
wasn't fun
difficult
and
job.
it's a difficult
It's a
job. It
very
really
difficult job.
is. It's a difficult and they want to help. They really do. I'm not saying there's not some bad reps out there, but there's some bad doctors out there too. But when you've got someone who really does want to help and wants to create that win-win, I mean, their job is to help you succeed and they succeed too. Really lean into that relationship. When do you let go? I mean, I think as we're talking about replenishing frames and maintaining inventory, we can look at maybe a practice that hangs on to a style, hangs on to a frame line for too long. When is the right time to make that decision to just let go and try something different?
I think actually the problem is that they turn it over their brands too fast and their styles too fast. Um, I love the frame industry. I love frames. I have a lot. I'm going to get more. It's an addiction of mine. I think they're beautiful and they're fabulous. But at the end of the day, they're 2 holes and 2 sticks, aren't they? So they don't change that much. People's heads don't change that much. And I think you're doing something right if the opticians are slightly bored by the inventory. I mean, do you think the team at the Gap is really excited to get it in another white t-shirt? Doubt it. Oh, this is a cap sleeve instead of a raglan. I mean, that's the most you're going to get, right? So I get that the team gets bored, so in that way, what you can do if you have a big enough optical is you can say, listen, 10% of the board space You do whatever you want with it, reassort it all you want, do whatever you want with it. But you have to be really intentional. That's the plan on the page. You have to tell the team how much they can play with, and they can't go outside the bounds of that. So if you carry 1,000 units, then maybe 50 of those or one frame line, reassort it as much as you want, do whatever you want, keep it interesting, keep it fresh, replace the brand as much as you want. And that could be something that they really engage with. They look at the industry, they see what's new and fresh, and they take risks. But the majority of the inventory, we only want to assess it really as a whole once a year. And the reason I say that is if we're asking our patients, is there a style, color, or brand I can have for you next time? And the average patient comes back every 12 to 18 months for their regular eye exam outside of contact lens wearers. Then we need to, if we're bringing in a brand in response to what they're looking for, we need to have it next time they're there. And what I often see is they'll bring in a brand. It may be something that they don't carry because it is more expensive. And 6 months later, it, quote, hasn't sold, and they drop it. Well, that patient hasn't even come back. So the next time I come in and you ask me the question what I want, and then I come back a year later and you still don't have it, that's what happens. So what we really need to do is give ourselves time to cycle through our patient base to give a brand the opportunity to perform. The other thing that we want to just pay attention to, just to bring back, is revenue generation. A higher cost brand doesn't have to sell as many units to be your top performer by revenue. And that's just working smarter, not harder. If you sell one, for example, Cartier, that could mean a month's worth of other frame sales to you. So when we feel that something is not selling, we have to look at the data by revenue generation, because you forget 3 months ago I sold this unit and it accounted for 10 other frame sales that I'm just kind of trying to blow through because they're less expensive. So frequency bias is something we want to pay attention to. And that comes down to annual reporting and looking at the revenue generated from our brands. So annually, we do a full assessment of the assortment and see what's performing. And then semi-annually, usually around the traditional vision expos, so around March and April or September, October timeframes, when the practice is a little bit slower, we've just come off a busy season, probably cleared out a lot of inventory in the Q1 and back to school. That's a great time to say, okay, how can I reassort the brands I have to make sure I have the newest, because that's when new product usually comes out, and the best sellers. Because if I sell a bestseller off the board, and then I go to reorder it every week, because we do want to do weekly or bi-weekly reorders as well, and it's backstocked, I might forget to go back and try to order it again. So that can happen. So every 6 months, we just want to ask the rep, and that's where they come in. I need your newest styles, and I need your best sellers. And I need something exciting to draw attention to the brand. I know the hot pink isn't going to sell, but people are going to see the hot pink, and they're going to buy the tortoise. So every 6 months, I'm going to have to return a hot pink. I understand that. And I'm going to bring in the electric blue. That's fine. But that's a return rate that we can handle as long as we're not doing it every single month or every quarter.
From a consumer standpoint, I think one of the most important things that you can provide is consumer confidence. And I think one of the obstacles toward anyone patient slash customer slash consumer walking into the optical is looking around staring at 800 frames. We won't get into it, but the peanut butter problem, right? Again, go back and listen to our last episode if you want to actually know what that is. But there's a strong sense of, I don't know what I'm doing out here. And one thing about consumers, regardless of what you're buying, is you don't want to feel like you're making a bad purchase. You want somebody to come along and lower the risk. And I think one of the most valuable things an optician can do is educate the consumer, not just on the quality of the products, not just on their vision benefits, but the why behind the purchase. This frame, this color would go perfect with your hairstyle, and you have a round face. So you're going to want to stay within this kind of frame in this size. We can get it in a different color too. Here's the kind of lenses you want based on the type of work that you do. What you're doing from an optician standpoint is making this purchase feel less risky. One thing about going online, especially, nobody knows what they're doing on there. But if we don't do that in the practice, then what we do is we just let the patient default to price. And we're always going to find some point of comparison to help us make a choice. But I think we've all been in that decision or in that position as a consumer where we thought in our mind, maybe I could get this cheaper. But the more we were educated and informed about something, we started to realize, well, I'm going to pay a little bit more, but at least I know I'm getting something I'm going to be happy with. I'm not going to look stupid in these frames by getting the wrong style. And I'm not going to have trouble seeing because this person really seems to know what they're talking about. I just don't know if the level of training gets there with most opticians, and I wish it did.
Well, I think it goes back to those procedures, those that scripting, those processes, right? You can one of the things that's really, really powerful, we do this with contacts, we advise it with contacts, but I advise the same thing with frames, is ask the patient to rate their frames, not their vision, their frames on a scale of 1 to 10 and see what they say. I just had a conversation with my brother yesterday. He's worn the same frame style for 30 years, and he's always had nose pads. And he said he has to go back to his doctor for the third time because his frame is killing him. That was the phrase. And I said, is it the nose pads? And he said, yeah. I said, why have you never worn an acetate frame? And he didn't know what that was. And my other brother was on and he just got acetate frames. And he said, they're great because they don't pinch my nose. And I exercise a lot. I always end up breaking one of the nose pads off. And then I get scratched and stabbed by the piece of metal that's left before I can get to the optician. So one of the things I always recommend is asking that question to rate your frames on a scale of 1 to 10. And then responding to that, whatever, if they say 7, okay, well, how can that be improved? And then they'll tell you something. So that's a great open-ended question. But the other thing is to reinforce and then recommend. You talked about online purchases. If somebody comes in wearing, for example, a Warby Parker frame or anything that they purchase online, Zenni Optical, Walmart, anything, and you as a professional notice things, maybe they're crooked, maybe they're drying and you see cracking on the side. Maybe the temples are too short, which is a personal pet peeve of mine. You say, that frame looks amazing on you. I think the color is perfect. I do think we can improve the comfort with a slightly longer temple. So we don't want to say, oh, you purchased those online, they're terrible quality. And I'm not saying anyone would do that, but I think by not having that reinforce and recommend cadence, we do it kind of subconsciously, where we're not giving them a compliment first. And you want to compliment their decision making and then say how you as a professional can improve upon that decision making. And we learn this in sales. So if you're having trouble selling something, closing a sale, when I worked in sunwear, for example, one of the things you can do is call over a colleague and say, what do you think about this frame? And the colleague has been trained to reinforce and then recommend because they have no idea what conversation you've been having. The question you're asking might be of the frame that you hate and told them you don't like, or it might be the frame that you want them to buy, and that person has no idea. So the colleague comes over and says, I personally love the color on you. Is there a color that you liked better? So you're not actually condemning anything. You're not actually saying anything is bad. You're opening up a conversation and giving your personal opinion. So that if your coworker said they actually didn't prefer that color on them, now the person has two things they can weigh up. Who am I going to believe? Who do I trust? But we haven't said that the color is bad in any way. Does that make sense? So it's very much reinforce their decision making. To your point, give that confidence and then give your insight on how even their good decision can be improved upon.
There's a fair amount of I don't know what I don't know, I think, from a patient when they walk into the optical. So I think these conversations are great, not just from the standpoint of educating the patients, but even just asking the right questions and having these conversations, it opens up knowledge gaps, right? Instead of it makes the patient aware of what they don't know in the
What they
optical.
don't know and
Yeah,
what
what
you
they
do
don't know.
know
And what
as a
you do know
professional.
and that huge gap in between, and that draws people in. This is so interesting. I'm glad we had this specific conversation because I think that's something that good salespeople do really well is they create these knowledge gaps and they draw people in because we hate not knowing something, especially
Right.
when we're going to spend money on it. And if I see you as a commodity, Susan, and I walk in and it's just glasses or glasses, I don't care. I can get them online. I can go to a big box store. How
And you're
much are
just a
yours? I'm going to walk.
salesperson
You're just a
and you're
salesperson.
just, yeah.
Yeah. But
And
once
I,
we're
I
it,
see it in coffee too. So just another quick example. Um, People often used to come in when I was selling coffee and they'd switch to decaf. And I'd say, why did we switch to decaf? Well, I'm getting heart palpitations and so I can't have the caffeine. All right. But they hate decaf because it tastes different. Right. So then your sales start to drop because they don't want to come to the coffee shop as much. So then you say, well, did you know that espresso actually has less caffeine than drip coffee? So why don't you try a latte, which is going to taste better, I know, and keep them coming back, as opposed to switching to decaf. And that's what people are looking for. They're looking for not it's not a sales pitch. It's I understand you, I see you, and here's how I can help. That's not a sales pitch. That's just filling a void.
and how did you start that conversation? Why did you switch to decaf with the question? Show some
Curiosity.
curiosity. You didn't say, "Hey, let me show you three new brands of coffee we just got in." You don't even know if they care, right? And again, that's the mistake we often make in whether we're talking about traditional sales or whether we're just talking about something you might consider influence, which is doctors have a lot of influence over the actions
Mhm.
and behaviors of their patients all day long. There's a term called non-sales selling I've used before, if that makes a doctor feel more comfortable, but we're doing it all day. We're trying to influence people's actions and behaviors, whether it's getting them to buy bare glasses or just getting them to take their eye drops. But the ability to do that, it works so much better when we take a interest in them and start with the questions. And again, it opens up that curiosity. And then people actually want the information. They want to know what other options are out there. But I think just it's how we frame it, how we communicate matters. Susan, as we close out here, I'm just going to ask you a question that maybe sums all of this up. If a practice owner listening to this or an optician suspects that their optical feels stale, they show up to work, they're like, well, this really looks stale. We looks like it did a month ago and looks like it did 6 months ago. We're really not keeping up with styles. It doesn't appear fresh. What's the first thing they should do?
The first thing they should do is have a try on party. So they need to bring their whole staff in, pay for pizza. Don't do a staff meeting. Don't talk about metrics. Don't talk about it's not a team building. This shouldn't be something that's dreaded. But every single person needs to try on frames and they need to find frames that they like. So often I talk to staff or doctors and they either don't wear glasses because they say, I don't look good in glasses, or they're wearing a brand they don't even carry. And your team is a great representation of your local demographic. They are your local demographic. They're probably all different ages, all different sizes, all different colors, all different personalities. They probably all express themselves in different ways. And some are more conservative, some are more outgoing. I guarantee you there's some people on your staff who can't find a frame that they'd be willing to wear and be excited to wear out in public. They might wear it to work if you force them to, but it's not how they would express themselves. And that's the first sign you're going to see that we don't have the fits that we need. Could be men's narrows, women's petites, large eye sizes, or we don't have the colors. Some people outside of work might only wear bright tropical colors, and you have no idea because you have a uniform. But they might want to wear bright orange and hot pink glasses, and you don't have them. And once you have that try on party, you need to take it again at face value and say, let's take 10% of our assortment and let's just have some fun. Every practice has what's referred to as a focal wall or a feature wall. It's usually the wall of frames that you see first when you walk in through the front door. And that's why I encourage people to enter the practice through the front door and not through the back. And that wall can be reassorted constantly. You can replace, rearrange, pull frames from other places. One season, if it's October, you can have an entirely black frame wall. And the impact of that is going to be incredible. Like Happy Halloween, we have an entirely black frame wall. If it's spring, bring in greens, pinks, purples, pull them from other brands, call in your reps, have some fun, and say, hey, I just want the bright colors. We know they might get returned, or they might be reintegrated into their brands, or they might be put on a vintage wall or a clearance wall, sale wall, whatever you want to call it, in order to sell it down. But the benefit of doing that reassort on that feature wall regularly and listening to your team and your patients. By the way, you can have fit parties with patients too. Call in your favorite patients from the last month that were super nice to you and offer them, free frames if they come for the fit party. So what you're going to lose in terms of potential returns to frame brands or, potentially buying things that aren't going to sell or potentially giving away free product, you're going to gain in excitement. You're going to gain in new, fresh ideas for your optical. This is outside of going to industry events and reading industry magazines, which is important as well. But this is just a really kind of more interactive way to engage your staff, your patients, and get more ideas for what you can carry in the optical.
You hit that from two different angles. I like to close these out with three things that you probably saw me jotting down some notes here as we're talking, but three really strong takeaways that I got that I think bear repeating. One, you talked earlier about simplifying the process. Can you fit it on a note card? I think that's worth asking. Can you fit it on a note card? The second one, which leads right into what you're just talking about, is do internal research. I think it's something that we don't do, and you hit it from two different angles. You talked earlier about asking the patient. We don't have what you want today. What would you like? What do you wish we did have? I think we almost never ask that question, but it's great to hear. And if you only hear it once that I want that hot pink frame, it's noteworthy, but it's not a trend. But once you hear something two, three, four times, your staff is hearing it over and over. Do you have a way of collecting that data and knowing what do the patients actually want? We don't know if we don't ask. Otherwise, again, we're just assuming. But you also hit it from the angle of the employee is having that party where you try on frames, getting their feedback as well. And that research can be incredibly helpful. Yeah, you're right. You can look at the trade publications and go to conferences and all that, but just doing that internal research. And the last one, again, just getting back to the data. Sometimes it's great to have feelings and hunches, and I don't think we should ignore those, but they don't always line up with the data. So you mentioned ranking by frames by the revenue that you got the previous 12 months, and then basing that off which brands got the most revenue, letting data inform your decisions more
Mhm.
than just emotions and gut feelings. So I love those three takeaways. So as always, Susan, incredibly insightful, and thank you so much for coming back.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Thanks to Susan, and thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of I Own a Business. Thanks, guys.